In the last video, we did some text validation and got our view model on our account screen all set up. In this video, we're going to start talking about persisting data using the new property wrapper in iOS 14 AppStorage. Now, basically what AppStorage is it's SwiftUI's way of interacting with user defaults. If you're familiar with UIKit, you've built apps before, you're probably familiar with that concept. If you're not, a quick overview of what user defaults is it's local storage on the device that will persist in between launches of the app. Now, it is not a replacement for like a database, right? You don't want to store heavy things in there like images or a ton of data. That is not what it's meant for. A typical use case would be like preferences or settings. Back when apps had to handle dark mode themselves, you could have the preference, prefers dark mode, true or false, and you would store that Boolean in user defaults. Or maybe you allow your user to select an accent color for your app, right? They can customize it. You could store that color selection in user defaults. So what AppStorage is it's SwiftUI's way of monitoring user defaults. So by using the AppStorage property wrapper, you can kind of watch that item in user defaults. And when that changes, it's like a state variable. The AppStorage will see that change and then trigger a UI update to, update the data accordingly where you're using that item. Now, if you didn't quite follow all that, that was the overview explanation. Of course, we're going to build it. I'm going to be explaining it as I go, so hopefully it'll make more sense then. What we're going to build is a user object and store that custom object into AppStorage, user defaults. Huge disclaimer, right? In a real app, you don't want to store your user in user defaults, right? Because if the user deletes their app, user defaults gets deleted, so they delete their user. That's not what you want. This, of course, would be stored on a server in a database. This app is educational purposes. It's actually pretty tough to come up with an app that's realistic and covers all the topics you want to cover. So I had to take some creative liberty here. So again, huge disclaimer. You're not going to want to store your user in user defaults, but it's the example I came up with to show how to do it. Because at the end of the day, these apps, this course, you have access to it forever. This is a reference for you to come back to. So when you're building your project, you're like, oh, I need to store a custom object in my user defaults. How do I do that? Oh, that's right, we did it in the appetizers app. Let me go back and look, right? It doesn't matter what we stored there. You can just come back, see how we did it, and then use that information accordingly. Disclaimer out of the way, let's start building. So the first thing we're going to build is that user object. So here in our model, let's create a new file, and it's going to be a Swift file, and we will just call it user. Hit create. So struct user, and here's the thing. It's got to conform to Codable, and let me tell you why. So when you're storing a custom object in user defaults or AppStorage, now if I use user defaults and AppStorage interchangeably, it's because they're kind of the same thing. Again, AppStorage is just SwiftUI's way of doing it. But anyway, when you're storing a custom object into user defaults, you have to convert it to data first, right? So when you're storing just like an int, a string, a foundational type, you don't have to convert that to anything. User defaults can handle that. But user defaults doesn't know what my custom user is. So I got to break that down into data first and then store the data in user defaults. So the flow goes like this. When we're storing into user defaults, we need to go from user to data down into user defaults. However, when we're retrieving from user defaults, right, because we want to retrieve this data to populate our user on the next app launch, we pull it from user defaults, but it's data, then we got to convert that data into our user object. So that's where Codable comes in because we're encoding and decoding data, right? We're going both ways. If you remember last time, we just used decodable because we were only going one way. We were just decoding. In this case, we're going both ways, so we're using Codable. Now, what properties does our user have? Well, let's go to our account view model, and it's basically all this stuff. We are replacing all this. So I'm actually going to hold Option. I just want the var. I don't need all the publish stuff. Command C to copy. Back to our user. In here, we're going to do a Command V to paste. Oh boy, not what we wanted. All right, we'll make this work here. I guess when you copy with the multiple cursors, it doesn't like that. So anyway, neat little tip here. Highlight your whole thing. Control I will do the automatic indentation here. And then if you know me, I got to tab these babies over. You don't have to do this. This is just my personal style. I think it looks neater. But again, I don't think I've said that too much in this course. Last course, I said that a ton. So yeah, our user is going to have a first name, last name, email, birth date, extra napkins, frequent refills, right? Basically all the stuff that was on our form. So now with this on our user, we can actually go back to our account view model and replace all this stuff with just a user object and make that user object published. So we'll delete all that, well, up until published, and then we'll go var user, and then that is going to equal, and we want to initialize an empty one. And when we initialize this empty one, if we go back to our user object, right, we have default values for our properties. That's why I just copied and pasted that over. So when I initialize a user and don't give it any values, it's going to give it blank, 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 today's date, false, false, because that's how we want our empty user to be when we first open up our account screen and see the empty fields. So back to account view model. That's why I can initialize an empty user, but I also get the member-wise initializer that has all this stuff, for when I need to create a real user. But for now, we're just creating the empty one. Okay, so we're going to get a ton of errors because we deleted all those properties, right? So right now I need to do user dot in front of all this stuff. And in fact, so much, I'm going to copy that user dot, just like I did the view model dot, and paste it everywhere I need it, right? So instead of just first name, it's user.firstname, user.lastname, user.email. Instead of just email, user.email. And then, as you can imagine, on our account view, we're going to have all this stuff as well. So again, view model dot, and then after the dot, user.firstname, after the dot, user.lastname, user.email. So all I'm doing is just adding view model.user.whatever we need here. Because again, everything is attached to our user object now and not separate properties. Okay, so let's run this on the simulator just to make sure nothing broke. Everything should still be fine. Okay, and if I hit account here, first name, Sean, last name, yep, save changes, we're gonna get an error because invalid email, cool, okay. Everything still seems to be connected and working, good to go. Again, that was expected, we just refactored a little bit to get set up for this. Okay, so back to our view model, we need to, save our user-to-user defaults using AppStorage, and then also retrieve it. So we're gonna have two functions for that. Well, we kind of already have one function, this save changes. I'm actually going to move this up top. I like it up here. And then we'll need another function, func retrieve user. So this is what will get called when we want to retrieve it and save it. So let's set up our AppStorage first. And that is the AppStorage property wrapper. So it would be AppStorage. And then here you have to give it a key, and that's a string. And our key is going to be user. Again, if you're familiar with user defaults, you had to give it a key because there's a key value pair in user defaults. So you would get like object at key, and it would have to match this identifier. So our identifier is going to be user. Then we're gonna do private var. We're gonna call this user data, because remember, it's going to be data. It's not like our actual user. It's gonna be of type data, but it's gonna be optional. Because again, remember, like if we've never saved a user, we don't have a user there. Okay, so let's clean up this top part a little bit. Let's work on save changes first, right? Okay, we no longer wanna print anything. We want to encode our user into data and save it into user defaults. So just like we did in our network call, I'm going to go back for a review here. Remember on our network call here where we're downloading the appetizers and we have to decode our JSON response. So we're going to do code that is very, very similar to this, where we create a decoder and we decode it into an object, just for review there, what we're going to do. So back to the account view model, we want to do a do, try, catch. So do, and what we want to do is encode our user into data, right? Because this is where we're saving it. We're converting our user into data, saving that data into user defaults. So let data equals try. This is the try of the do, try, catch block. And we want to do JSON encoder, right? Not decoder. We're encoding it to data. Create a new one, dot encode. Value is user. So we're encoding our user that's up here, published, right? And that user is constantly being updated as we type stuff. And then in order to save this user-to-user defaults, we need to set our user data variable up here that is AppStorage equal to that. So we do user data equals data. And then I'm getting an error because I haven't written out my catch block yet, so catch. So now we want to handle the error, like just in case this encoding went wrong. Because remember, it goes into this catch block if this encoding fails. And usually this encoding will fail if like you messed up your model and like you had a typo in here or it doesn't quite match. That's the common reason why this will fail. But still, we want to create an alert here. So back to our account view model. Well, we already have an alert item, right? We've already set that up for our isValid form. So now we just need to pass in a different alert context for the specific cases. So back to our alert. Let's create another alert context here. Again, copy and paste to get the structure. So this is going to be called user save success. And here in the title, we'll say profile saved, just that. And we'll say your profile information was successfully saved. Done, okay? Back to our account view model. do a Command B to make sure we get some autocomplete here. So now in this, well, that was a success case. I meant to do the error case, but hey, I got ahead of myself. We need to do that here, right? Because we want to show a pop-up when it was saved successfully. We don't want them to just hit the save button and then like nothing happened, right? We want to notify them that, hey, this was saved successfully. So we can do alert item equals alert context dot user save success. Okay, so now we need the error one. Back to our alert, we got to create that. Again, copy, paste, and we'll call this one invalid user data. And then what we'll tell the user is, call it profile error. Say there was an error saving or retrieving your profile. Because we're going to use this for both when we try to retrieve it and there's a failure, and when we try to save it and there's a failure. So again, that is invalid user data. And again, these error messages, like I said, I'm not an error message pro. You know, you want these to be really, really good to let your user know what's going on. Back to the account view model. So now in the catch block, we'll set our alert item. And if you remember, whenever our alert item changes value, it's going to trigger the UI update and show it. Alert context dot invalid user data. Okay, clean this up here. So now let's walk through this. When we tap save changes on our account screen, first we're going to check to make sure the form is valid, right? We don't want to save anything that's invalid. Then we're going to encode the user, which is this user here, which if you remember, anytime we're typing in the field, this user is getting updated because it is published, it's attached to our text fields and all that stuff. So whenever we hit save changes, whatever user we have, we're going to encode that into data. We're going to set our user data equal to that data. And our user data is our user defaults, essentially. Again, that's what the AppStorage property wrapper does. So it's going to save that data at the key user in user defaults. And then if that goes through successfully, we're going to pop up an alert that says user saved successfully, good to go. If for some reason the encoding fails, we're going to pop up the invalid user data. Okay, so let's run this. Let's go to account, first name, Sean. Okay, let's hit save changes. Okay, invalid form, they're not filled out. That is still working. Always want to test that. Okay, Allen, email, seanallen.dev@gmail.com. Birthday, we'll just leave that it is. Again, we're going to optimize this birthday thing later. Cool, April tax day, or day before tax day. Cool, I want extra napkins. I want frequent refills. Okay, so remember that, April 14th, 2020, I flip these on, you see my name and my email, hit save changes, profile saved. Your profile information was successfully saved, right? It went into our do block, success. Hit OK. Now what we're not doing, watch when I stop this and I run it again, it's going to be blank. Because if I go to account again, like we're never retrieving from user defaults. All we did was save to it. So the next thing we got to do is retrieve it. Okay, back to our code. Okay, so we're going to do that in retrieve user. And again, I like 2 spaces in between my functions here. Okay, so retrieve user, the first thing we want to do, if you notice, our user data is nil, right? When we haven't saved anything yet, right? The user's first launch or they haven't created a profile, it's going to be nil. So we want to make sure we actually have data there before we try to decode it. Because what's going to happen, if we try to decode it and it's nil, it's going to go into our decoding catch block. Let me actually write out the code. It'll make more sense when I say that. But we need to guard let user data equal user data else, and we're just going to return if this is the case, because this is the case on, like, again, a fresh launch. And how we're handling the fresh launch is we have this default blank user that we're initializing, right? So we're going to get all the blank stuff that we want. So we don't have to like show an error or anything like that if it's nil. So we want to make sure there is user data in our user defaults. If there is, now we do basically very similar to this do try catch, except instead of encoding, we're decoding, okay? So do, and then we'll say user equals, because we want to set this user equal to whatever we pull from user defaults. User equals try. Let me move this up again. My head might be in the way. Try JSON decoder, right? We're decoding from user defaults. Dot decode from, and then we want to do user. This is where you just have the actual type that you want to convert the data into. And then what data do you want to make a user out of? Well, that's our user data that we have in there. So here we type user data. And then Xcode's telling me like my errors aren't handled because I haven't written out my catch block yet. So now we want to do alert item. This is if the decoding fails, right? If we try to pull out a user and we can't do it, alert item equals alert context.invalid user data, right? The same error that says we couldn't retrieve or save. Okay. Now, when do we actually call this retrieve user? Because on save changes, right, we do it, when we tap the save changes button. We already had set that up. If we go back to our account view, see on the save changes button here, we have viewModel.SaveChanges. So that's when we were calling that. Well, on the retrieval, we want to call on appear. So in our navigation view here, above the alert, we can do .on appear. And then here we do viewModel.retrieve user. Okay, hit resume, make sure everything's good to go. So now, because we have already saved the Sean Allen user in user defaults, it's already there. We just haven't retrieved it yet. So now, as soon as this screen appears, viewModel.retrieve user is going to be called. And then on our view model, this is going to run. We're going to make sure we have data in there. Again, in our case, we do have data because we already saved Sean. If we hadn't saved Sean in there yet, then this would return nil, nothing would happen, you would just get the default user. So if we have data in there, we're going to decode that data into a user and set that equal to our user, which again, the user is published. So when this user object changes by getting set to something else, published means it's going to broadcast its change, and then our account view, listening to that change, will trigger a view update and populate the new data. And then, of course, if we can't decode that for some reason, we're going to show the alert context invalid user data. Okay, so let's run this and test this out. Okay, so let's tap on account, and there you go. Sean Allen, all my stuff is there, April 14th, my extra napkins and frequent refills, right? So now our user data is persisting in between app launches. And the thing to remember about like user defaults is if the user deletes your app, right, they just get rid of it, then user defaults will clear as well. So the stuff you want to store in there, make sure it's not something super useful that if the user deletes the app, they never have that again, because user defaults gets deleted when the app gets deleted. Okay, so that is data persistence with AppStorage and user defaults. Again, AppStorage was brand new in iOS 14. It's basically just like a state variable that watches user defaults. And again, the disclaimer here is you probably don't want to be saving your real user and user defaults for reasons like I said. Usually a user object is much more complex than this, so it's probably too complex for user defaults. And if the user deletes their app, they delete their user. So you want to keep your user on the server, but again, it's just an educational example of how to store a custom object and persist the data in between app launches.